Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. We've been hearing some interesting things about Xbox coming out of Japan recently, and I want to talk about it, so let's get into it. So what's been going on, if you haven't heard, is that Xbox is selling 4 times faster this generation with the Xbox Series X and Series S in Japan than they did last generation with the Xbox One. And now what that means in terms of numbers is that we are expecting that by the end of this year, they will have sold 100,000 units in Japan, whereas last generation, it took them nearly the entire generation to do that. So, a very impressive and very important increase in sales for them in that region. Now, yes, of course, a lot of people will point out, and rightfully so, that when you compare that number to the number of sales that the PlayStation 5 has had in the first year in Japan, being nearly 1 million, or the astronomical number of sales that the Switch had in Japan in its first year, it's not a very impressive number in terms of just raw unit sales. But when you keep in mind the fact that Xbox really doesn't have any amount of mind share in Japan, people kind of view it as an afterthought. This 4 times step in the right direction is extremely impressive, and I believe that there's plenty of reasons to suggest that it will continue to grow. So this massive increase of sales can and has been attributed to a huge variety of different reasons. But I think that the number one thing that ties them all together is the fact that Xbox and Phil Spencer are, for the first time really in history, making Japan a priority. They're really focusing on them as a key part of their strategy because it's probably the largest market that is more or less untapped by the Xbox brand, meaning that there's a huge amount of growth potential in that region, and so they're focusing a lot of their business attempts on making sure that the Japanese audience feels more catered to, more appreciated, right? Doing things like making sure that the Xbox actually launches day and date in Japan as it does in the West, unlike last generation where I think it was several months, maybe up to a year before they were able to even begin selling the Xbox in that region. Now they're doing things like making sure that games don't just have Japanese subtitles, but some of them actually have full Japanese language voiceover, like we saw with Redfall at the Tokyo Game Show, right? Things that really make the Japanese audience begin to feel like they are an important part of Xbox as a brand, right? That feel like they matter to them. And one of the biggest things is that Xbox is making sure that they're starting to get a lot of these Japanese games onto Xbox, because there has been this trend in the past, and I'm sure it'll continue for several more years, where a lot of Japanese games by default just go to PlayStation or Nintendo because those are the brands that those developers are familiar with. They're aware that Xbox exists, but it just doesn't feel like a viable option, a worthwhile use of their time to port their games to a marketplace that in their region doesn't really exist, And, if you look so far back as like the 360 generation, there was a time where things like Final Fantasy and Metal Gear and Yakuza, even those would by default just go to PlayStation and Nintendo without them even having to buy exclusivity, right? Because it was just a thing that would happen. They didn't have to worry about it. Whereas nowadays, PlayStation is still getting Final Fantasy as a timed exclusive in the case of 16 and whatever the Chaos one is called. I think Origins, whatever. They're having to now actually pay for it, which is a huge change for them, And this is happening because Phil Spencer is flying over there and he's building this relationship with Japanese devs, with the big name ones like Sega and Square and Capcom, and making sure that all of those games actually come to the Xbox brand, but also smaller things. They are actively making a concerted effort to talk and deal with Japanese independent studios and help those studios out. Come in, make sure, hey, do you guys need anything? Can we help you make these games what you want them to make? I mean, can you also put them on Xbox? That sort of thing, right? And that's huge. It really is going to sort of endear them to the Japanese game development sort of group, right? You know, that's why we're starting to see things, even things that definitely would not have hit the Xbox platform, things like Scarlet Nexus or AI the Somnium Files, coming to Xbox at the exact same time that they're launching onto the PlayStation 5. It's a huge step in the right direction for them. And on top of that, they're even starting to get a lot of those Japanese sort of legacy titles into Game Pass. Things like a lot of the Final Fantasies, like Dragon Quest XI, like the entire Yakuza series. And what that does is that, you know, you can just look at how happy Sega has been with Game Pass, right? It's proving to these developers that their games can be successful in the West, being, you know, showing how many people are playing the Yakuza series on Game Pass, how many new players are engaging with Dragon Quest. You know, these are franchises that have been massive in Japan for, you know, since their inception, and yet are still fairly small in the West. But Xbox is showing them that they can be a lot more, and that's massive. Then on top of just making sure that these games come to Xbox, they're also trying to make sure that they're starting to get a couple of exclusives, right? So, you know, there's that huge rumor that they're gonna partner with Kojima and have him make an exclusive game for them. And whether or not you believe that is one thing. I personally am hopeful for it, even though I'm not super a huge fan of Kojima. I think a lot of his games they just go over my head. But you know, it goes without saying that he is sort of a legendary figure, and especially in Japan, and any game that he made, if it was exclusive to Xbox, would drive Japanese consumers to want to play it on the Xbox, right? So that's very important to them. And even if that rumor turns out to not be true, you have to keep in mind that, of course, now Xbox owns Bethesda, which includes Tango Gameworks, which is led by Shinji Mikami, who, much like Kojima, but maybe on a smaller scale, is very much a legendary figure, and he's going to lend a lot of credibility to the Xbox brand in Japan. You know, he's the guy that created Resident Evil, which is one of the largest global titles in existence right now. So just having him around is, as a part of the Xbox brand, is going to do a lot to sort of make Xbox more of a household name in Japan, right? And, you know, you can continue down that road of, like, things that they're doing to appeal to the Japanese audience, all the way down to, like, apparently the Japanese audience really loves the Xbox Series S. You know, they think that it's, you know, they love its size. There's a lot of quotes of them saying that it's cute, which is understandable because the Japanese, like, living conditions, a lot of the times, especially in more urban areas, they have very small homes, right? It's a very highly, you know, dense population area. And so asking people to find a way to fit these massive monoliths like the Series X or especially the PlayStation 5 into their home console setup is kind of a big ask. And I'm sure that a lot of them will figure it out. Clearly, a million of them have already bought PlayStation 5s and are figuring it out. You know, so I'm not saying that they won't buy that, but it's a lot easier of an ask to be like, this very small box, you can just stick that right in there and play all of these games through Game Pass or whatever. It makes it a lot easier, is what I'm saying, which is, I think, why they've responded to it. And at the same time that Xbox is doing all of these things to sort of endear themselves to the Japanese public, to do things that they know that the Japanese audience will be more receptive to, PlayStation is sort of going in the opposite direction, right? You know, much like how we're seeing articles about Xbox doing better and better in Japan, we're also seeing articles about Japan kind of starting to feel a little bit abandoned by PlayStation. You know, there's, like, PlayStation, a lot of their business is moving to the West. You know, they've moved their headquarters out of Japan and into, I think it's in Europe now. You know, having like, when I started paying attention to the games industry, the man in charge of PlayStation was a Japanese man named Kaz Hirai, and now it's Jim Ryan. And a lot of those higher up positions have become Western people, not Japanese, right? And I know that sounds like kind of a weird, bigoted thing for the Japanese audience to not be fond of, but Japanese business is very different from Western business. They're a lot more formal. There is actually part of the Japanese language that is specifically dedicated to how you address and talk to people in a business setting. So it's a big deal for that business to be changing to a more Western style, And then on top of that, PlayStation has also been, backing out of Japan in terms of their studios, closing down Japan studio and having less partnerships with the Japanese, development scene. Their focus on more Western style blockbuster games like, God of War, Spider-Man, Horizon Zero Dawn, those are all huge games over here. But in Japan, God of War did not do very well because it's just not the kind of game that they respond to, right? And so the fact that those are sort of what all of PlayStation's big titles are these days is not something that particularly thrills the Japanese audience. Even, little things, again, like the fact that they made it so that switching how in the West, the X button is confirm and the circle button is back, right? In Japan, that was always backwards because, in their culture, X is like no, and then the circle is like correct, right? So the circle is the confirm button and the X is the back button, which is why when you play a lot of Japanese games, that's swapped if you've played Japanese games. And with the PlayStation 5, they've made it so that it's the same across the board. Like in all of the regions, it's exactly the same. So when you're dealing with a PlayStation menu, even if you're in Japan, the X is now confirm and the circle is back, which is a very small thing, but it's just another sort of, piece of straw on the camel's back as to why they're starting to feel more and more abandoned by PlayStation, So it starts becoming this question of like, as a Japanese consumer, are you going to sort of stick with the guy that you've been with who doesn't seem to care about you anymore and is focusing on other marketplaces and doing things in other places? Or are you gonna move over to the guy who's doing everything in his power to treat you right and do what you want, And for a lot of Japanese consumers, I think that choice is going to be to switch over to Xbox. So then the question sort of becomes, how can Xbox continue to grow in Japan? What can they do to continue to become more and more prevalent in that region? And I think it comes down to three major points. The first one is one that's already starting to happen, which is cloud streaming. At the time that a lot of these reports of them selling 4 times better were coming through, cloud streaming hadn't launched in Japan. In fact, it just did, like, I think, the day after their Tokyo Game Show presentation, something like that. And in Japan, unlike here in Texas, they actually have the internet infrastructure to make streaming kind of a viable option for games. And on top of that, the Japanese audience apparently really loves mobile gaming. They play on their phones a lot. They love taking the Switch on the go. They're playing it on trains and on, buses, because they actually have public transportation, which is another thing we don't really have here in Texas, at least not good versions of it. And so that sort of mobile market is huge for them. And so now with cloud gaming and Game Pass being accessible in that way in Japan, I think we're going to start seeing a huge uptick in the number of Game Pass subscribers as that word of mouth of like, hey, this works and it's really good and it has a lot of the games that we care about on it starts, building up. The second thing is I think they need to get to a point where they completely cut out that default exclusives thing, right? That thing that I was talking about earlier where a lot of Japanese developers or just Asian developers in general don't see Xbox as a viable location for their game. Because there are still some really big name games and franchises that are not on Xbox at all, really. Like Final Fantasy XIV is still not on Xbox, and that game is one of the largest MMOs going right now. Genshin Impact is not on Xbox, and that's, again, massive at the moment. The Persona series, the list goes on. There is still a lot of work for them to do in the realm of making sure that all of these games are actually available on their platform, So you got to get rid of that default exclusive thing, right? You got to make sure that the Japanese audience sees Xbox as a place that is worth having their games on. And then the third option, and it's one that I know for a fact that they're already looking into, because Phil Spencer has said on multiple occasions that he is that they need to acquire more of a presence in Japan, either through acquiring Japanese studios or through building up a brand new studio just in Japan, doing like what they did with the Initiative, but just over there, right? And I don't know which one of those is more likely. I kind of hope that they do both. We've been seeing all kinds of rumors of them acquiring Japanese studios. Phil Spencer has specifically said that he wants to look into acquiring Japanese studios, but, at the same time, there's also been rumors of them acquiring every studio that exists. So it's kind of hard to sift through, the reality of it. But I do definitely think that it's something that they're looking into. And if you do all three of those things, make cloud streaming fantastic in Japan, get rid of the default PlayStation exclusives, have more of a studio presence in Japan, I think that you can very quickly get to a point where Xbox is no longer an afterthought in Japan. I don't think that Xbox can necessarily ever get to a point where they're going to be outselling PlayStation in Japan, and they certainly will never get to a point where they can outsell Nintendo in Japan. But if they can just get to a point where the Japanese audience sees Xbox as a viable third place brand for gaming, then that's going to be huge for them in terms of sales. And it's something that I think we should all look forward to, because it's going to mean that there's going to be more competition in the Japanese game space just in general. And competition always breeds success, So here's hoping. So that's what I think about these reports, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Do you think Xbox can find success in Japan? If so, how? All that. I really genuinely love hearing all of your thoughts. And if you liked this content, please hit like on the video, or better yet, subscribe to the channel. It really does help me out more than you would think. But until next time, I'll see you around.